Good morning, everyone. My name is Waleed Rezeq, and today I'll be talking about Frank Lloyd Wright and the American cities. This presentation mainly talks about his biography, some of his most popular projects, Frank Lloyd Wright and urban planning from different aspects, some comparisons, the conclusion, and the references at the end. Frank Lloyd Wright is a well-known architect. In some cases, is considered the best architect in the United States. He was born in 1867, and he was not only an architect, but also a designer, writer, and educator. He designed more than 1,000 structures over a creative period of 70 years. Wright believed in designing in harmony with humanity and the environment, a philosophy he called organic architecture, in which he implemented in most of his projects. Frank Lloyd Wright also developed the concept of the Usonian home in Broadacre City, which was his vision for urban planning in the United States, in which we will talk about more in details in the upcoming slides. Here we can see some of Frank's most popular quotes, in which we can try to understand his ideology more and his philosophy, and how he finds nature very important in designing his projects. Now, mentioning briefly some of Frank's most popular works, first is Falling Water. Falling Water is a house designed by Frank Lloyd Wright in 1935 in southwest Pennsylvania for the Kaufman family. It is one of Frank's most popular works. After its completion, Time called Falling Water Wright's most beautiful job. Falling Water exemplifies his philosophy of organic architecture, as I mentioned earlier, the harmonious union of art and nature. It was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1966, and Falling Water is the only major Wright work to come into the public domain with its setting, artwork, and original Wright-designed furnishings intact. The second project is Guggenheim Museum. It's an art museum located in New York City. It's the home of an expanding collection of Impressionist, Post-Impressionist, early modern, and contemporary art, and also features special exhibitions throughout the year. In 1959, the museum moved from rented space to its current building, a landmark work of 20th century architecture designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. Now we'll talk more about Frank's ideology into urban planning. Frank's solution to the issues of the American city and territory was made public. Broadacre City, his hypothetical project, offered a vision of a territory-wide, middle-class commuter suburb, with elements spread across a territorial grid. The frontier mythology had been fundamental to both Wright's personality and his spatial ideas. The frontier mythology is one of the influential myths in the American culture. The frontier is the concept of a place that exists at the edge of a civilization, particularly during a period of expansion. This period of time became romanticized and idealized in literature and art to form a myth. Now, continuing in his ideology, despite the criticism that Frank has got, he was not against cities by nature. Instead, he urged us to look around and recognize that what is called a city nowadays will always be in constant change. None of this was inevitable. Wright always said that it was the architect's role to humanize the city. One of Wright's ways to do so was to look beyond the city, look for the wider, more inspirational space, the universe and its nature. Okay, now talking about Broadacre City. Wright first suggested the Broadacre idea in a book called The Disappearing City in 1932. But it wasn't until 1935 when he introduced a model of Broadacre City at an industrial design fair held at Rockefeller Center that the public took note of. Wright's first Broadacre rendering, shown in a 12-foot square, 8-inch high scale model, showed what a low-density modern city might look like if virtually all that was remotely urban was eliminated. The majority of the model was taken up by neatly gridded plots for minimum houses, as Wright would later call them. Looking down from above, the Broadacre model resembles just about any American suburb at first glance. It does not seem radical. His philosophy behind his concept of Broadacre City was for it to be a tool for positive social change. Independence of the citizen was what he offered for the inhabitants of the Broadacre City. In fact, his ideal community was a complete rejection of the American cities of the first half of the 20th century. Frank had a coherent vision for cities and urban planning. Decentralizing was the goal, giving each family a piece of land, building the community from scratch around this principle. Now, talking about Broadacre City and technology. Wright saw forces arising in modern cities that would lead to his new design. The most critical of these was mechanical mobilization, with the introduction of the popular automobile. The scale of a city became irrelevant. Cars caused traffic and gridlock in areas designed for pedestrians or perhaps horse-drawn carriages. Distances were often shortened as a result of electrical power and contact. Telephones and radio rendered adjacent offices and businesses obsolete, and long-distance electricity transmission rendered the Suits spewing city power plant obsolete. We can see how Frank thought of technology and how to incorporate it in the Broadacre City was a very important element that he was thinking of. This is a map that shows the zoning and functions of Broadacre City. We can see a variety of different functions distributed in different areas. This is Frank Lloyd Wright's vision of the city. It's a sketch, it's kind of a sketch coming alive. So this is a simple video showing how his vision was towards Broadacre City. In the years after creating Broadacre City, Frank Lloyd Wright had a handful of chances to plan real urban environments. Few of these projects were ever built. Two of the biggest, though, provide a window into the changing urban ideas of one of the most influential modern architects. The first project is Crystal City. Washington, D.C., in the mid 20th century was growing quickly and needed new residential development. Developer Roy Thurman saw a chance to jump on the growing mixed-use trend and built a massive project in one of the last undeveloped tracts of the capital, and brought on Wright to plan it. Crystal City was about as far from Broadacre as you could get. It was inspired by the Rockefeller Center, which Wright saw as the entrails of the final enormity. It was to be 21 dense, mixed-use glass and marble buildings in the midst of a track of oak trees. It featured a 2,500-room hotel, an underground parking garage, and an approximately 1,000-seat movie theater along with thousands of apartments. Wright claimed that two walls of every room would be made entirely of glass. The project fell through when the National Capital Planning Commission, in part because the design was nearly twice the height allowed under the Height of Buildings Act. Although Wright continued to fight for the project for a time, he eventually abandoned it after discovering that Roy Thurman's fiancés weren't as certain as he believed. Now, the other example is the plan for Greater Baghdad. In 1956, at age 89, Wright was commissioned for one of his last projects, a master plan for Baghdad, Iraq. With an influx of oil money, King Faisal II saw the chance to rebuild Baghdad as a modern city. He brought on a cadre of architects, including Le Corbusier, to update parts of the city, and hired Wright to plan the center. Wright's plan centered on Pig Island in the Tigris. Here he would build an opera house, a garden with fountains of Adam and Eve, museums for both historic sculpture and modern art, and a monument to the 8th century Caliph Harun al-Rashid. A university campus was planned across the river, and all of these elements formed a constellation of circles and arcs, echoing the historic circular design of Baghdad. Wright was inspired by childhood love of 1001 Nights and an appreciation for the historic architecture of the region. Ziggurats for parking were scattered throughout the plan, and the opera house was topped with a sculpture of Alauddin and his lamp. Unfortunately, King Faisal II was assassinated in 1958, and the plans were shelved. Later administrations did not believe that the beautiful designs met the needs of the people in Baghdad. This design, this design does, however, reveal an older Wright more willing to compromise Broadacre City with the realities of modern urbanity. In a small comparison between Frank Lloyd Wright's approach and different architects, the very different models of Ebenezer Howard's Garden City and Le Corbusier's cities built on towers in a park invite immediate comparison. Surprisingly, depending on the actual acreage of the surrounding parkland or greenbelt, the average population density of Broadacre on the one hand and the Garden City and the Corbusian dreams on the other were not all that different. Both Wright's and Le Corbusier's plans are based on the car, with one vision predicting a centralizing impact and the other predicting a decentralizing effect. In the pictures here, we can see the difference in approaches of Frank Lloyd Wright, in which he proposed a more horizontal urban city, and Le Corbusier's approach, in which he proposed a more vertical city. As a conclusion, Wright envisioned Broadacre extending across the country, but he had little success putting his plan into action. Wright has always gone beyond the expectations, and with his deep admiration to the technology of that era especially, the car made him think in a very dynamic way to create cities, or what so we call the modern suburb, as an outlying part of a city or a town. Away from the technological impact on Frank, his ideologies of promoting freedom and democracy were obvious avatars of the Broadacre city. Frank designed for a better community to provide inhabitants with a democratic life rather than creating a city based on architectural symbolism. And finally, the approach of Frank Lloyd Wright and many different architects in designing the ideal city is definitely something every architect should think about, as it is our job as architects to not only create and design spaces and buildings on a small scale, but also to think through this idea from a larger scale. Designing a better city results in providing a better environment and atmosphere for the people of the city. Opinions and ideas might be contradictory, as designing a city incorporates many different aspects. Now, these are some of the references I used in my research. And these three books really helped me understand more Frank Lloyd Wright's ideology into urban planning and into designing an ideal city. Thank you very much for listening.